right, and we're back with another awesome episode. I got Rodger Carlyle. Did I say it right? Carlyle?
Carlyle.
Carlyle. Rodger Carlyle's here with us today, and he's got a new book out called The Shadow Game, but it's not his first book. Rodger's been writing for a minute now, and we're going to get into all that. But Rodger, how you doing?
I'm doing well. You, sir?
I'm good, man. Thanks for joining us all the way from Alaska. We got a big time difference, but we made it work. So this is awesome to have you on.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Well, first, let me ask this. How does it feel to, you've published several books before, but how does it feel to publish another one? I like to ask every author that because um, it's unique for every person, no matter how many times they've published or whether it's their first one. How does it feel to be putting another book out?
Um, I guess the best way to explain my current feelings about this is almost relief because this book has taken about 2 years to create. And it is one of those books that was written and then rewritten and then rewritten. Um, and I think I get every book gets a little bit better, and I think this is probably the best I've done.
So let me ask this. You've published in two different genres, which we'll talk about a little bit. But you've also got a pretty robust website. How did you get into writing, and where was kind of like your early career at?
Well, we'll spend just a few minutes to do a thumbnail. First, I was a kid raised by a single mom most of my life, and that ended up in a really difficult environment. And my mom passed away when I was about 10 years old, and I ended up moving back with my father, who was on a rocket career, and which took him from the state of Washington, where I spent my youth, into New York City. And as I developed there, I had one singular passion, and that was I had always, all my life, I wanted to fly and build a career flying in the Navy. And to get there, I ended up, while in college, joining what's called the AVROC program, which is the Aviation Reserve Officer Corps, and was well on my way to that career and lost my medical and ended up kind of lost. It had become such a passion for me that I really struggled to find something else I wanted to do. And I had already, I was in an accelerated education program. So I just took a year off and I went to Alaska just for a break. I had an opportunity to work for a year for some people that I knew, and kind of fell in love with it, uh, fully thinking that I was not going to spend my life here. And in fact, I didn't. After a year and a half or so, I left and tried to make a go of law school. It bored me to tears. Um, so I ended up back in Alaska and hit here at the perfect time. I was the Trans-Alaska Pipeline project manager for the largest construction project ever in the United States for a major Fortune 500 company.
Wow.
And during that time, I began to hone my business skills. And after that project was over, I ended up starting into business for myself and built 5 different companies over the years. And one of those, well, a couple of those, I spent a lot of time overseas, a lot of time, especially in Europe, a lot of time in Russia right before the fall of the Soviet Union, and then after the fall, uh, uh, before Putin came in and screwed everything up, um, and had a great business career, had wonderful family, wonderful kids. Ended up getting divorced, but my kids and my ex-wife and I remain very close and still remain to this day a circular family. Um, and then I woke up one morning uh, and found out that I had a very rare form of cancer,
Wow.
and that knocked me on my fanny. The treatment was bad enough, but more than that, it just completely sapped me of all my energy. And I was trying to build 5 companies simultaneously at this moment.
Oof.
and ended up just shutting two of them down completely. Took a big bath financially. Two of them I ended up selling to my employees. One of them for substantially less than that I had in it. The other one for about what I had in it. Kept one company, but I woke up after about 3 or 4 months of that and said, my kids still love me. My dog still loves me. Is this really what I want to do for the rest of my life? Do I want to keep building this corporate empire? And the answer to that was no. And all my life I had written. I did a lot of political writing. I've written, I don't know, maybe half a dozen autobiographies for campaign managers for candidates. And decided, well, I love to write, and that's what I'm going to go do. So I built that last company up to the point where somebody made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and pulled the plug. And this is all I've done for the last 10 years.
Wow. So how long ago was the cancer?
Well, I've actually had the cancer just over 20 years ago, and was very fortunate. It was a very, very rare form of cancer. Nobody knew how to treat it. So we just guessed, and obviously we guessed right.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, and it's good thing because I mean that's cancer is scary. I've known so many people that have had fights with cancer, and a handful have lost it, and it just seems like one of those things that it feels like a death sentence when you say the words, but it isn't necessarily. There's a fight involved.
It, I, the cancer never frightened me. I never felt that it was going to kill me. Um, but what it did do is just completely sap me of all of my energy. I had, surgery and major radiation, way too much radiation. And I spent a year, I was used to working a 70, 80-hour week, and I spent a year working a 20-hour week. And you just can't build five companies working 20 hours a week. So
Oh
uh,
no.
at the end, you have to ask yourself once in a while, is all this worth it? Is where you're headed where you should be? And the answer to that was no. Um, and I've always loved writing. I especially love the political writing, although I have to admit, the reason I worked for campaign managers rather than candidates was want to keep my name off all of it. Uh, so often, what I would write would turn out to be complete nonsense, or at least a good portion of it were blatant lies. Um, so, but it was fun. It was fun working with them. It was fun being involved in campaigns. Um, but it's life is a little too short to put your name on bad work. So at least now I can take great pride in what I write.
Man, that's a good point. Life is too short to put your name on bad work. I think that's incredible. So, what is a typical writing session for Rodger like?
Well, I'm very disciplined in my writing. Well, I will say that I'm disciplined by most standards in that I write 5 hours a day. Uh, a first hour of that is always dedicated to research. Second hour of that is always dedicated to rewrite work that I've done the day before, and then 3 hours of actually getting words down on paper. And I write. It takes me about 4 months of just pure research before I start a book. And that's after having a great deal of material gathered from 25 years of traveling around the world and just gathering information. And then once I start, it takes about 9 months to get the first draft down. And I do all that here, at the computer that you can see me sitting at now in my home in Anchorage. And then when I get the book draft finished, the next step is, of course, the cleaning up and polishing part. And I can do that anywhere. And I choose to do it at a little log cabin in the middle of nowhere in Alaska, sitting on a screen porch watching a river run by. Um,
Not a
and
bad view.
it's a really good deal, and it's very private. And I don't have to hear my phone ring. I can't get into the internet and do any more research. I've got to stick with what I've got.
Oh, I'm
Of
jealous of
course,
that.
if it's really, really bad, I can open a beer, grab my fly rod, and head for the river.
Okay. Yeah, you got to cut loose every now and then.
You got it.
So, 5 hours a day. You got a pretty disciplined schedule. I will admit that. Um, what was it like publishing your first book, and how have you changed your approach to writing since then?
I the first book was a great deal like my first date. Um, I had no idea what I was doing. Uh, it was I thought there was a love affair there, but I wasn't quite sure, and I had absolutely no idea how to go about doing it correctly. Um, so um, the first book, the great joy was, of course, seeing it come out, seeing it in print, seeing people start buying the book, getting feedback from peers all over the world that had seen the book. Um, but just full of mistakes. Some of them editing mistakes, some of them, you know, the kinds of things that anybody who writes historical fiction will end up with, where you end up with debates with political historians who will say, well, that didn't happen in March of 1866, it happened in June of 1866. And for a little while, I tried to clean all those things up and worry about them. And then I realized it really didn't make a damn bit of difference in the way that the book was put together. And that was probably the best lesson I got out of the first book.
And what was the first book?
Well, my first book was in historical fiction, and the name of the book was was Two Civil Wars, and Two Civil Wars. Uh, what I like to find in historical fiction, I like to find snippets of history that just somehow don't quite make sense when you read it in the history books. And in this case, I travel a lot. I've spent a lot of time in Mexico, and I kept finding notes in the archives in Mexico about Abraham Lincoln's involvement in the Mexican Civil War between Benito Juarez and Maximilian, the Emperor Maximilian. And it's crazy. That was the exact same time that he was fighting the American Civil War. And it turns out he was deeply involved in that Civil War down there and created a lot of hell for Americans living down there, because eventually neither side in that Civil War trusted Americans because of his involvement. And in the end, unlike the American Civil War, which resolved a lot of our differences, not all of them, but a lot of them, it left Mexico in a complete mess. And it still is today, 200 years later. And that was the beginning. That was the first book. It was not the first book that I published, but it's the first book that I wrote.
Okay. And the first book you published was which one?
The Eel and the Angel. And it is more of a current affairs book. It was actually the fourth book that I wrote. Um, and it takes a look at where the United States and China are heading right now, at the technical advantages that each country has developed, and how they use those to try and gain an upper advantage on the other. And it's basically a spy thriller, uh, but more than that, it's also a real analysis of how we refuse to get along with each other, um, at a time when it would really be helpful to the world.
So you said you wrote a lot of political papers, a lot of political documents. Um,
Correct.
when you do your research, do you find yourself finding topics that you would be interested in doing nonfiction in again?
Um, I think there are topics. I have got enough outlines of books right now to write for the rest of my life. Um, and it just comes down to picking the ones that I like and starting the book.
Hmm.
Um, so, the research, yes, each time I do new research, I come up with new ideas. But it's kind of like that first date book I talked about. You have to eventually arrive at a model that works for you. And um, I've got a bunch of really good stuff already underway. So that's what I'll stick with for a while.
So you have the Grit series, and then the Walker series, which is what Shadow Game right here, your newest book, is in, which you're going to talk about here in a minute. But I want to
Right.
talk about the Grit series,
Okay.
before we get into the new one. And it looks like you have three books in that series, starting with Enemy Patriots.
there are 3 books in that series, and there will be 1 new book in that series and 1 new book in the Walker series come out next year.
Okay. Okay. So tell me a little bit about the Grit series before we get to the Walker series.
Well, the Grit series, again, it's primarily historical fiction, and it's a unique approach in that I take one family and I follow that family and their involvement in the development of America, our conflicts, and American politics from 1820 through the present. And literally from the shortly before the United States acquired Alaska through the present. And each of them takes in a different time period and a crisis in America and looks at part of that history that the history books didn't spend any time on or didn't get right. A good example again is like the story about Lincoln's involvement in Mexico and the crisis that it created for Americans in Latin America, and the crisis that it helped continue in Mexico to this day, and tries to explain it with a thriller instead of trying to write history. You can write all the history books you want, but nobody will buy them.
Yeah, that's true. There's a guy by the name, I think it's Stephen Hartov. Do you know him?
I know Harkov, yes.
Um, had a magnificent book that came out this year. I had him on the podcast. I think it was like Remember the Seven or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but great book. Historical fiction, was just awesome. I really enjoyed it. And then a guy by the name of Alex Aronson, and he does alternate historical fiction, where he takes an event that happened, like Nixon won, or what if so and so didn't win the election, and what happened after that, or what if we never the wall never fell down, or the Soviet Union never collapsed, and what about how would these events be different if it was alternate fiction? And he kind of writes that timeline, which is really interesting stuff. And it's cool. It was cool to hear him talk about that. And I think it's a lot of people think, oh, when you write fiction, you're making everything up, and that's just not true. There's so many authors out there that they do a ton of research, and obviously you do a ton of research. So a lot of what's in the book is based on fact, and it's got a twist to it. And historical fiction is very much that, but with a little more rich and in deep detail.
I think the historical fiction that I write is probably 90% fact. I put new characters in it because so often when you look back at history, these alternate moments in our history that I talk about, the history books have eliminated anybody in that environment. You know, I can't find an American history book that talks about Lincoln's involvement in the Mexican Civil War anywhere, but it's
Mm-hmm.
all over in Mexico. So you have to create the characters that allow you to develop the plot. And in this case, I like the other things, and I can say this from my personal life. Um, Passions are much higher in times of crisis. So I love to put a great love affair, or maybe a couple of them, into my books and show the passion that comes out of people under immense stress who have to depend on each other. So that there's that part of my book that especially the women who read the book really like.
So when you are doing an outline for a book, how do you prefer to do the outline? Do you have a very robust outline, or do you kind of have a shell of an idea and kind of go as you go?
My the complete outline of a book goes on one page, the outline. And then what I have is multiple pages that develop specific characters and settings. And the characters and the settings get plugged into that one page outline. But no, I stick very closely to a single page outline.
Wow, wow. So it's all up here, and the brain comes out through the keyboard.
Well, I it's again a learned process. When I first started writing, I tried to put a far too detailed outline in, and what I found is I kept finding uh, in the story, I kept finding problems in writing a part of a story, and I'd do a little more research and find out that the outline really needed to change anyway.
Hmm.
So I really look just for the highlights of the events that I'm looking for, get them down, and then fill in the characters and the settings. And of course, one of the joys that I have is I get to write out of Alaska. So any part of that includes Alaska. And Alaska is it's part of a plot, it's part of a setting, and it also almost becomes a character in a lot of the books.
I found I have my first novel done and it's out on submission right now. But I found that I tried really, really hard at first to develop a very detailed outline. That way, I had a master document to reference back to. Um, and I try to be really organized with that. And what I found was that along the way, I thought of ideas and new twists and new things, and I couldn't stick to that outline. Or then I found something that didn't make sense, and I was like, I don't want to go in that direction. I actually want this to happen to that character because it's going to throw everybody off, and they're not going to see it coming later. So I just found myself going, I think I'm going to do a much smaller outline. So now I just use note cards instead of a document. I just grab note cards and I write act one on it and I write down ideas. Act two, write down ideas. So then I say, in this act, I want it to get to here. And then in act two, it's going to go from here to here. And then I can write sub cards that say a little bit more. And I could just do like one line sentences, like this happens to so and so. It happens because of this. It will appear in act three. And I found doing that opens me up to being able to write easier because I'm not confined to such a detailed outline. And I really thought, as an organized, very organized person, I really thought that having a detailed outline that I could follow to the T was going to be what would make this process the easiest, and it actually made it harder.
Yeah, and I think first of all, I fully understand exactly what you said, Jeff, and it is completely consistent with what I found. The other thing that I found is developing characters is a lot like raising a child. You begin with the character who you think you know, and as especially in fiction, as the book begins to come together, that character grows and changes. Um, and you find they would make very different decisions, a third of the way through the book than you think they would have when you started the book. And I like to let those decisions play into the book because it comes across as far more honest. And the characters have a lot more depth to them.
Do you find yourself in writing historical fiction trying to stick to a character so that you stay true to the story? Or do you kind of let that freedom go and say, I'm trying to stick to the historical facts of maybe a situation and letting the characters do a lot more of the world building?
The actual situation is normally you could put it down in 4 or 5 sentences that for an entire book where I'm trying to go with the historical situation. So no, I let the characters paint the picture of that entire historical situation. And as they develop it, as they change, as long as they begin at the beginning and they end where I want the book to end, I let them go where they want to go.
Okay. Okay. Sorry to pick your brain about it. I just find it very interesting. It's already a challenge to write and to write a story. But then when you're trying to do, you're trying to stick to a historical perspective and historical facts, then you have characters and you're like, well, if I let this character develop too much, are they going to deviate far away from the story I'm trying to tell and stay close to that 90% fact? So I find the balance very interesting, and I commend you for being able to do it because I don't know if I would be able to, but it's very interesting.
The second, one of the other books in this historical series is a great example of that. The name of the book is The Opposite of Trust, and it has characters in it. It's a U.S. Russia, a U.S. Soviet um, spy thriller, and but the primary characters are on the U.S. side. There's an American diplomat and a military officer, both who were denounced during the McCarthy era. And on the Russian side, it's two people, again, a politician and a military officer who are under extraordinary scrutiny from the Stalinists trying to beat back Khrushchev's reforms. And then, so the story is each side battling their own back while they try to battle each other in the Cold War.
Mm.
And as long as I was able to maintain the thread of what was going on in the Cold War at that time and where the story begins and ends, it was really fascinating trying to let those characters trying to fight the battles both in front and behind them, only to find out in the end they were a lot more alike than they were different.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now on your website, and wow, I tell you what, I love your covers. Enemy Patriots, fantastic cover. Opposite of Trust, fantastic cover. I mean, they're all just fantastic covers, and I love the idea of a Russian bomber trying to deliver a threatening message to the American Air Force base that crashes on a remote Alaskan lake. Like, could you imagine the chaos that would happen today if that incident occurred?
Well, to begin with, we would know today when the timeline for that book, there were so many gaps in radar on both sides that, Americans flew espionage missions over Russia for hours at a time, and the Russians, for the few times that they could even see them, didn't have an aircraft capable of getting high enough to shoot them down. And on the American side, we had so many gaps in our radar at that time. We thought we had a great radar coverage. We didn't. The Russians actually flew over Alaska airspace all the time, and we didn't know about it. And the only way I know that is spending a lot of time in Moscow in the archives and finding records from those flights.
Hmm. Wow, that's cool. I don't know if an American could go to Moscow and do that today without being questioned.
Oh, I think there's a great deal of chance that they would probably be encouraged by the Americans not to go there right now, and I think that would be very prudent. I had my share of troubles, and I would spend a lot of time over there during the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's you know it, one of the things that I've learned about people in this country. They We have two huge gaps in knowledge and what we know about our country, and they come from the same thing. Most Americans have never ever seen abject poverty. So what we see as poverty is middle class in most of the world.
Hmm.
And the other thing is most Americans have never traveled and spent time in some place with authoritarian leadership.
Hmm.
And you you really learn to watch where you walk and what you say. Um, I had a very good friend in Russia who was a former GRU colonel, that's the Russian military intelligence colonel. And as an experiment one time, I put on an American CIA sweatshirt and walked with him down the street of Moscow. We got stopped 9 times in the first 30 minutes, which was a really wonderful experiment. And each time he would show his credentials and we would just explain what we were doing, and people would start to laugh, but they'd walk away nervous.
Wow. And when was this?
19, about 1988 or 89.
Wow. I imagine if you did that today, they would lock you up.
Oh, somebody picked you up instantly.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like it, I've read a couple of books from some fiction authors about Russia and very, very detailed spycraft. And when you do the research and find out that like some of this was real, it's fiction, but it's based off of real events from real, spies, stuff that's really happened, and you go, that's pretty horrifying that you know Russia looks at us that closely. But then to your point, most of us here in the United States don't understand our freedoms. We don't understand our freedoms to the degree that we should, because if you were to go to other countries where they do not have the freedoms that we have, it would be shocking. And I wish more Americans could travel abroad and get cultured and witness that, because it's eye opening to realize that like you think it's bad here because you have to show your ID to buy cigarettes when you go into the quick shop or to buy alcohol. Go over to some other place where maybe you can't even buy it, or you got to be somebody in order to buy certain things. The hierarchy of society is a lot different, and yeah, like you said, our poverty what we see here is middle class in a lot of other places.
Yeah, an first example, or one of the first examples I saw of, for example, the cigarettes and the alcohol and so forth. My family, for a period of time, actually lived in Iran, and of course, we lived in an area of Tehran where it was almost all expats. People from all over the world were living there, primarily involved in American business in the oil industry and so forth. And we had supermarkets with beer and wine and liquor stores, and you could buy virtually anything in that area. And nobody said a word as long as it was in that area. You picked up a bottle of Jack Daniels and handed it to an Iranian friend who left with it, and there's a pretty good chance that he would be followed and eventually picked up. Um, so, it's crazy how few Americans understand what true liberty, the value of true liberty is.
Oh yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's probably a crisis here that we don't understand that like we should, and I think that's part of what's kind of pulling the fabric of our country apart. But that's a big discussion for another day. But let's get into the Walker series now, because your newest book in the Walker series is going to come out when people hear this podcast. It will be out. You'll be able to go buy it. But it's called The Shadow Game, and this is the advanced copy, so this is not the final version, but it'll look very similar to it, and you can go get it on Amazon and Rodger's website. I think you sell autographed copies under, don't you?
Well, it's available on autograph copy on my website. It'll be available from Amazon, and I'm going to hedge on that in that when the book, the Russian book of American-Russian conflict in the opposite of trust came out, my timing on that was either perfect or rotten. I don't know which, because it came out the day after Russia invaded Ukraine. And Amazon, which had set up, we had spent a ton of money and energy building up for the launch of that book. Amazon refused to launch it because they took the position that we were taking advantage of a horrid international situation. And they sat on that book for 90 days before we finally got it on the shelves. So I'm praying that this book, which is built around conflict between a family and the United States, and that same family and Iran, coming out at a time when Iran and the United States appear to be squared off again, I'm praying that this book hits the shelf before that gets any worse.
I know, right? You got what, 13 days before the 14th of November? Like, you just need Iran to
I
just
figure cross.
behave for
Yep.
2 more weeks, guys. Like, that is crazy though. That, of course, it's silly for Amazon to do that. Like, did they think that you wrote that book that day and that you're trying to take advantage of it? You wrote it over a course of a year.
There, Amazon is not the only media company out there that's under a great deal of scrutiny now about um, uh, the way they treat ideas that they don't like or that they're afraid of or that they think may interrupt their market elsewhere in the world. And I'll just leave it at that.
I agree. I agree. I think the censorship and some of the selective
Yep.
things that some of these companies do, uh, to me, it's a limitation of free speech. And I think you don't have a problem with certain things when it makes you money, but when somebody has an opinion about something that you don't like, you're selling all kinds of stuff on your website, but then you have a problem with somebody of writing a fiction book about a topic. I think that drives me nuts, man. But let's talk about the Walker series. The first book, you mentioned it earlier, the Eel and the Angel. That was book one, and now we're on to book two. But let's talk about book one for just a second here. Well, tell us a little bit about that one.
Well, the Eel and the Angel begins with a young analyst from the Farragut Information or Farragut Technical Center in the Navy piecing together two or three just snippets of information. And again, there's a theme there similar to my historical fiction, but on certain things that are happening in espionage that just can't possibly be happening. It's the situation, the locations where it's happening are so well protected that it's almost impossible to think that somebody can do it, and yet there's enough evidence that it's happening that they begin to search for that. And the book is really built around two different concepts, one on the American side and one on the Chinese side. Each side today has huge technical advantages over the other in certain areas. For example, the Chinese are absolutely brilliant at metallurgy and at combining technologies, substances together to arrive at new substances that nobody ever dreamed could possibly be put together. And they're doing that religiously right now in how they're building products, but especially in how they're building their military. And of course, in the U.S. side, we have huge advantages in information technology and especially in aviation, which is why the Chinese are constantly trying to copy what we are building. So this basic story shows how each side ends up using their technology to try and find out what the other side is doing with the opposing technology, and the thing ends up in a espionage super investigation on the Chinese side and on the American side, and eventually it leads to conflict. Because each side feels that they're so threatened by the other side's technology and they aren't able to learn about it, that the only solution is conflict.
Okay. Okay. And then you have book 2, The Shadow Game.
Yep.
Right here, comes out 14 November. And very interesting, The Shadow Game is a story of how one family can stir up a war between two countries and how the terror of nuclear weapons on American soil creates chaos and demands for retribution. Let's talk about The Shadow Game, this next offering in the Walker series. What can people expect when this launches on 14 November?
If I could, I'd like to just read you a couple of synopses that have been done on the book by people other than myself.
Absolutely.
But I think probably the description better than I hit. And the first one is from a very good friend who simply wrote, when a family uses their wealth to invest in media influence, artificial intelligence, and weapons in order to draw the U.S. into a nuclear war, the only barrier to their success is a group of brilliant misfits, Team Walker. And they are a group of misfits. There are only 8 people in this entire team trying to save this country from getting into a nuclear war. The second one came from the Book Life Prize, and they said Team Walker is reunited to unravel a domestic terrorist threat. Meanwhile, an ambitious young man is torn by his family's vendetta while he tries to navigate the world of divided loyalties. For all, the insidious terroristic threat may hit closer to home than they'd ever imagined. The story is actually drawn from my personal life. From the time that my family lived in Iran, we have maintained friendships with a lot of Iranian expats. And when the Iranian Revolution actually occurred, there were 5 different groups that banded together to overthrow the Shah. 4 of the 5 were eventually pushed away, mostly destroyed, many people killed by the regime that is now in place, the Khomeini regime, which is the Islamic State regime. And those people left the country, and they, to this day, dream of how they could get Iran back on the right path, that they think, back to being part of the world instead of this renegade regime that is stirring up trouble all over the world. And I thought a lot about that, and I thought, well, several of these families that I know have wealth, extraordinary wealth. I remember one family whose 22-year-old son got married while we lived over there. And as a wedding present, the family gave he and his new bride an around the world tour and $22 million to buy art for the home they were building while they were gone. And when they left Iran, they were able to get a tremendous amount of that wealth out of the country. But even with that wealth, they have not been able to change the regime. So the question was, if you eventually get to the point where it's got to be done, how are you going to do it? And the answer is, if you can't do it, you need to find an ally that can help you do it. And of course, the United States is not going to go nuke Iran for no reason whatsoever, but it is the one country out there that could change that regime in a matter of days if we chose to. So that's where the story begins. This one family trying to figure out how to stir up conflict between the United States and Iran for regime change.
Whoa, that's you would think, the United States has been brought into a lot of wars, and we've stood up there and been the world's police. So for us to show restraint in some of the actions we've done in Ukraine, and kind of show some restraint in this whole Israel thing, they say there's no troops on the ground. We know that there's probably some, because they've admitted that there's some special operations guys in there helping rescue American citizens. But to see that and to think, what kind of war would it be between us and Iran?
Well, let me backtrack just one step from that question. Um, this is feasible now. What I write about is entirely plausible, and what has made this possible is artificial intelligence. The ability of having documents released, of having videos released, of having news broadcasts released that were created through artificial intelligence that are almost undetectable from the real thing,
Mm-hmm.
has given enormous power to people who would like to use that technology for nefarious purposes. And I note that even the U.S. government today is trying to stir up an international conference on artificial intelligence and how you can detect it. Um, so the way this begins is through this very wealthy family's use of artificial intelligence to begin prodding each side, and then eventually expand that prodding into actual uh, small jabbing attacks on each side, which are so well documented that the Americans are hitting Iran and Iran hitting the Americans through artificial intelligence, that even the intelligence agencies can't sort out what's right and what's wrong.
So it's a misinformation war.
It's a misinformation war uh, with, unfortunately, a lot of bodies along the way.
That's very interesting. Unconventional war, I guess you could say, where we're not using conventional weapons initially. There's a different. Normally, war breaks out because of an attack, a terrorist attack. People invade. An airstrike. You name it. But in this case, war breaks out because of misinformation, something that was posted on Facebook or whatever it has, because artificial intelligence is behind it.
It begins with that and then expands into actual attacks. But the attacks that are Iranian on American soil aren't really the Iranians, and the attacks on Iranian soil aren't really Americans. Each side gets blamed for attacks being committed by a third party who does an extraordinary job of documenting that the Americans or the Iranians were responsible. And they keep prodding harder and harder and harder until they get what they want.
Very interesting. And like I said, I'm going to dig into it this weekend. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the things that we're talking about right here. And I really want to see how you wove that, especially attacks on American soil. That's very interesting because, that doesn't happen too often, that somebody comes over here and tries to sucker punch us. So it'll be cool to see how you wove that thread.
Well, there's one. The Americans are very, very good at protecting the homeland. Um, but the intelligence people that I've worked with over the years, every one of them has said the same thing. All of the technology that we use for protecting ourselves isn't worth anything by comparison to human information that you learn on the ground, boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is find one niche. Weaponry can be so damaging today that a single niche in that armor can create a lot of hell. And of course, if you're going to write a thriller, you might as well create a lot of hell along the way.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And something I've been exploring and I kind of explored in my first book is like the consequences of us using AI and technologies and relying on them.
Yep.
I work with some guys who used to be drone operators. They were sensor operators on different drone platforms. And just to hear them talk about some of the things that they can talk about and how their daily lives were and workload, it was like, you sat behind a screen the whole day, looking at a screen the whole day, using different AI programs and different softwares. And like, what's the consequences of us using that and relying so heavily on it? What does it do to the psyche? What does it do to human thought and decision making when I don't have to think as hard because I have a computer who's doing it for me? So that's some of the things I've explored in my books that I'm working on. And I think it's very interesting to think about that because, we don't think much of it, but I found myself even this week going, you know what? It used to be so awesome when there wasn't constantly a TV playing. There wasn't a smartphone in my hand. When you went and sat in a waiting room in a doctor's office, you just sat there and read a magazine. Now everybody's on their phone. There's a TV on the wall. Like we have technology all around us, and it's not the worst. But at the same time, you kind of wonder, like, how much has it changed society?
It has changed society, and I'm looking forward. When you get to the point where you want somebody to take a look at your book, I'd love to do that. They, because the second question, of course, in AI that nobody is asking yet is how easy is AI to hack? So,
Yes.
is the intelligence that the drone operator is looking at and the programs that they're running, are they really the programs that were originally developed, or have they been modified in some way by some other side? So you get a warped view. Uh, this is the technology has the potential to be extraordinarily valuable to mankind, but it is
Yes.
also extraordinarily scary to me.
Well, I read an article, and I talked about this. I had Andrews and Wilson on like a month or so ago, and I was chatting with them, and I brought this story up because we were talking about their new book, and it had AI in it. And I said, "There's an article that the Air Force tried to redact and not publish, um, but basically." They had a simulation set up where they had artificial intelligence that was manning a drone, and they had a drone operator on the ground that was kind of calling the shots. And the AI's goal was to destroy this target. Um, but when the operator told the AI, hey, here's how to do it, when the AI disagreed, it got in trouble. Well, then when it got in trouble with the operator and realized the operator is actually in my way of achieving my goal, it eliminated the operator in the simulation. So then they went back and said, no, no, you can't do that. You're going to lose points if you eliminate the operator because they're on that side. So then the AI said, okay, well, if I can't eliminate the operator, I'm going to cut the communications. I'm going to cut the electricity. I'm going to cut, everything. So then the operator is absolutely useless. And then I go and I destroy the target how I want to. And I thought, in a simulation, one of our own technology came up with that. It's a simulation, so it's not real, has no real effects. Man, that's scary. That
The
that
problem with
scares me.
artificial intelligence is that there is no difference between operation and simulation.
Hmm.
They can be one and the same, and the lessons that artificial intelligence learns during those simulations goes into their system as well. And the question is, how deep in there does it go, and when does it pop back out again?
Yeah, yeah. And I talked to Jerome Preisler about this too, because he writes in the Tom Clancy Net Force series. And me and him had a long conversation about AI one time, and it was about the fact that it's not about the fact that AI is itself is a scary thing. It's that it's so smart. It doesn't take the time to learn like we do. It learns instantly because it's drawing from the internet, it's drawing from all these sources. Whereas me and you right now, I'm learning from you and you're learning from me in real time, but we're absorbing it right now. AI already knows it. So that's to me is the horrifying thing, because it's like it doesn't have bandwidth that limits it. It can just move and adjust on the fly, and it can guide the conversation however it wanted to. And
And
what if it drove the conversation into a really dark place?
and and it does not yet have the social and moral underpinnings of human intelligence. So when it makes decisions, it lacks that depth.
Yeah.
Uh, for example, in this book that I just finished that we're talking about, um, I don't call on AI to make hard decisions, but the AI does a bang up job of explaining, of learning what would drive the other side to make hard decisions and putting those into the documentation so that instead of just talking about a something that happened that supposedly the Iranians did to the United States, it puts that into language that would scare the hell out of an average American, as opposed to the language that they would use with the French or the British or even the Iranians. And those things, again, AI is so smart. It can learn that stuff so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it doesn't have to figure out what the ramifications are. It doesn't have to do that.
Yeah. It just knows fact. And I think
Yep.
that is what's scary, because me and you can know what fact is right now, but we could also know that in this current situation, it's not applicable because it has second and third order negative effects. So we're going to make a in the moment, common sense, rational decision, whereas AI knows fact. So if it knows, and going back to the operator scenario, it knew that the operator was in the way of it achieving its mission. It didn't put into consideration that the operator was on its side, what would happen if the operator died to its platform, et cetera, et cetera. It just said, the operator's in the way. I'm going to neutralize that threat and I'm going to carry on. In a way, that black and whiteness is good, but it lacks depth.
Well, if you go back, 30 years to the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, um, the artificial intelligence in that spaceship and the operator um, got into the exact situation that you just talked about. And as I recall, the operator's name was Hal, and the artificial intelligence got in a knockdown, drag out fight with Hal. And eventually, artificial intelligence decided that Hal was just an obstacle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Same situation, exact same situation.
yeah,
30 years ago, we predicted this.
right. And to think now it's actually happening. Like
Correct.
movies are becoming real life now, whereas years ago, like movies were just figments of imagination. But now it's like technology is advancing so quickly that it's becoming real. It's no longer fiction anymore.
Yeah. So it is the challenge, the true challenge, I think, of the next couple of decades. Um, I just hope we've got 2 decades to figure it out.
It's a great point. Great point. Well, Roger, congratulations on the Shadow Game. It's out 14 November. Hopefully, Amazon doesn't hold it up and Iran doesn't act up, and we get the Shadow Game, an AI centric book. It's going to ask a lot of moral questions. Going to be a lot of interesting topics in it. And before I let you go, why don't you tell everybody where they can learn more about you and find more information?
Okay. Um, Probably the best spot would be to go to my website, rodgercarlyle.com. That's RODGER, RODGERCARLYLE.com. And I'd like to make one other observation based on one of yours earlier. If you look at any one of my books at the cover, you will see each of the covers have the flags of the countries involved in the story on the cover. So if you want to look at a story that includes Iran and the United States, the Shadow Games has both flags of both countries on the cover.
Yeah, I see it. I noticed that in a couple of the other ones. I thought, well, that's kind of neat. but I didn't notice it on this one. It's a little darker down here at the bottom. But yeah, I like it. That's very cool. Well, Roger,
Well,
thanks again so much.
I very much appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks for the help.
Yes, sir. We'll take care and we'll talk again soon.